In 2025, more than 50 years after it was published, Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings was removed from the library of the United States Naval Academy. More than half a century later, this book is still being treated as urgent, is still being treated as dangerous, and whenever society works this hard to keep a story out of reach, I think it's worth asking why. I'm Dr. James Bell III, the host of Equity Matters, and this is In the Margins. This is a space where I want to look at books that have been challenged and have been pushed to the edges and really ask a different kind of question. What do these stories reveal about the systems that we're living in right now? And for me, that's what makes Maya Angelou's memoir so relevant today. Because beneath the conversations about censorship is really a deeper question about whose knowledge counts. In a moment where we're told to follow the data, why do we still struggle to recognize lived experience as a form of evidence? In a lot of professional spaces, we talk about being data driven. We talk about the evidence, we talk about the outcomes, we talk about metrics, but we still struggle with a basic question of how do we treat lived experience as data? Because if we can't answer that, we're not just missing out on information, we're actually inactively deciding what counts as knowledge and what's going to be dismissed. And historically, that decision has never been neutral. It's been referred to as double consciousness, this idea that Black people are forced to see themselves through their own eyes and through the distorted lens of a society that refuses to fully recognize them. And what gets missed in how that concept is often simplified is this: it's not just psychological. It's about whose way of knowing becomes legitimate in the first place. So when we say things like lived experience isn't data, we're not making a methodological statement, we're making a power statement. What happens when lived experience enters systems that were never designed to validate it? Ultimately, it's going to get translated and then it's going to get sanitized. Dare I even say whitewashed? It's going to get rewritten into categories that are easier to measure but harder to understand. And so in that translation, something critical is going to be lost. And at the simplest, that's meaning. Because you end up with data without lived context. And that's not neutral. We're actually stripping away the truth that has already happened to people. And so you're probably wondering, what does all this have to do with Maya Angelou, right? And so I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings is not a traditional, straightforward memoir. And it doesn't behave like this clean record of life. It moves the way memory actually moves, and that's through interruption. And there's a lot of silence, and there might be moments that return with more weight than clarity. And that matters because from the beginning, Angelou was writing under conditions where voice itself has already been compromised. You had a child who was sent away, a child who experienced harm that reshaped how language felt in the body. And then the same child stopped speaking. And it's not because nothing happened. It's actually because something did. And the mind did what it often does when experience exceeds what language can safely hold. It breaks the connection between voice and survival. So when people describe this book as just a coming of age story, I feel like they miss what it's actually documenting. This book is documenting what happens when a young person has to build their identity in unstable conditions. In this story, we had shifting caregivers. You had racialized environments that defined belonging before she could, and institutions that were present, but they weren't necessarily protective. And it feels like it was a world that taught her early on what she was worth, whether she agreed or not. And so it almost reads like someone trying to piece together meaning from experiences that were never fully witnessed in real time by the systems around her. And I feel like that's a critical point because nothing in this book is happening outside of institutions. You had schools present, you had community structures present, family systems were present. And presence is not the same as recognition. And I feel like Angelou showed us that gap over and over and over again. And it reminds me of like the current conversation of like what gets recognized as knowledge is often what's stable and linear and like clean and easy enough to categorize. And I feel like that forced a different kind of question onto the reader. And it wasn't really about like what happened to her, but what kind of systems produce a child who has to make sense of the world this way in the first place. And once you start thinking of it that way, the book stops being just a personal narrative. It's more diagnostic even. And not diagnostic of Maya, but of the environments that shape what she had to become in order to survive them. One of the reasons why this book remains so relevant is that Angelou presents racism as an environment when most of the time we only see it as a collection of these isolated events. And Angelou demands that we see it as a set of forces that shape everyday life, whether anyone names them or not. You know, the racism in I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings isn't confined to like a single villain. It appeared over and over again in schools and employment opportunities and expectations and mobility, even in like the spoken and unspoken rules of who belongs and who doesn't. And that distinction matters because many of our current conversations about racism still focuses solely on events. You know, you think about a video of a police encounter or black students who are being disciplined more harshly than their peers. The same type of controversy over a school district arguing a curriculum or book bans or whose history gets taught. And Angelou invites us to ask perhaps a different kind of question. You know, what's happening when the camera is turned on? What kind of conditions existed before this complaint was filed? And so in public health, we talk a lot about the social determinants of health. You know, the conditions in which people are born, they grow, they live, they work, they age, they play. And what Angelou shows us is that racism operates in much the same way, not simply as something that people encounter, but as something that people have to navigate every day, over time, across institutions. And when something like that becomes environmental, people have to adapt to it. You know, children are going to learn where they're welcome and where they're not. They're going to learn where they are not. They're going to learn which parts of themselves are safe to express and what type of opportunities truly feel attainable. They learn how to move through systems that were not designed with them in mind. And again, that's what makes this memoir so valuable, because it's not just documenting racism, it's documenting the process of learning how to survive inside it, it raises a difficult question for us today. If disparities in education, housing, healthcare, economic opportunity, if they continue to appear generation after generation, what are the environments producing them? Not who should we blame, but what conditions are keeping these outcomes generating the same outcomes? And once we begin to ask that question, we move from the kind of that individual prejudice that I think where many of us are more comfortable analyzing to the system. And the fact that we're still even having this conversation it tells us something important. More than 50 years after its publication, people are still debating whether I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings belongs in a public institution. It makes you wonder, what is it about this book that continues to make people feel uncomfortable? And I don't think it's because it tells an extraordinary story. I mean, it does that. But I think it's because she tells a familiar one in the questions that it raises. You know, who's getting believed? Whose experiences count as evidence? What forms of knowledge are treated as legitimate? And also, what happens when the people closest to the problem are the people least trusted to explain it? These are the type of questions that are relevant today, just as they were when Angelou first wrote the memoir. And this goes back to what I was mentioning in the beginning, in public health, social work, policy, wherever, we often talk about being data driven, and we should. Quantitative data matters. Numbers, they help us to identify patterns and evaluate outcomes. And they tell us how many, they tell us how often, and they can tell us if a condition is improving or getting worse. But there are questions numbers can't answer on their own. Like, what does racism feel like when you encounter it as a child? Or what happens to your sense of self when your humanity is repeatedly questioned? How does trauma reshape the way a person understands safety or belonging or their own voice? There isn't a dashboard out there that can answer those questions, and spreadsheets can't fully capture those experiences because it requires a different form of evidence. It begs for testimony and memory and lived experience. And yet, in many of our professional spaces, we still treat those forms of knowledge as secondary. We're comfortable calling them anecdotes, and yet we ask for more data when what we often mean is data that feels comfortable to us. And I know why the cage bird sings challenges that entire hierarchy. It expands our evidence. It expands our understanding of what evidence can be. When Maya writes about trauma and identity and the isms, she's really documenting dimensions of human experience that our traditional measures struggle to capture. And she's showing us the interior consequences of those external conditions. These are the lived realities behind the statistics. There's a training that I helped to create a while back called More Than Numbers, where we talked a lot about how we move beyond those traditional quantitative metrics and really try to appreciate the lived experience and digging into the understanding of what people encounter on a regular basis and how their story matters. And that's part of the reason why we're still having this conversation today in 2026, because there's this tension between the narrow definitions of evidence and the broader ones. We shouldn't be forced to choose between quantitative and qualitative. And the goal is really to recognize that neither is sufficient on its own, because numbers are going to tell us the scale of the problem, but stories are going to help us to understand the meaning. What I want folks to understand as we think about lived experience, we think about book bans and challenges with publishers, this is all an orchestrated attempt to minimize our lived experience and to silence stories that need to be told, stories that need to be heard, new perspectives. When you see Black authors being disproportionately represented in these book challenges and these removals, it's directly tied to race and identity and lived experience. This is about power. This is about control. And so what I really would love for us to do is to spend some time organizing and really recognizing like our own power. And when there's opportunities to do so, how do you amplify your voice? How do you amplify the voice of others to ensure that they're heard in spaces where they might be challenged? One thing that you can do immediately is sign the petition in my bio to tell corporate publishers to stop silencing our stories. Let people know that you recognize the gap and that you want to be able to access the wide spectrum of experiences that are out there. The other thing you could do is to support independent bookstores. Amazon is convenient. I know. I use it. I wish I could say I didn't, but it's there and I use it. But there are independent, small Black-owned bookstores that you can attend who put on hell of events. I've seen them, who will ensure that stories that matter to you are accessible. So do me a favor, share this episode with someone who loves to read, someone who loves Maya Angelou, someone who's a quantitative researcher. Let them know that you heard it, you thought about them, and you thought it'd be relevant. And just continue to listen as we continue to explore in the margins and some of the lessons that we learn when we question the system and not the individuals through some of these narratives.